So topic 14, infections of the human body. We're going to be talking about the body's surface, so the skin. We're going to be talking about the respiratory system, the digestive system, the urogenital system, the nervous system, and the circulatory system. So I'm going to break this particular unit up into a few lectures, about maybe 20 minutes each. I'm hoping that most of this particular lecture will be review. At least 50-60% will be review. There will be a few new things thrown in there because we're going to talk about in more detail some things that we've discussed previously, such as things like pneumonia and tuberculosis. We're going to talk a little bit more about staphylococcus and so on. Topic 14 is the last topic for this course. I'm hoping to get it done this week, and next week I will be posting some review lectures as well, so stay tuned. So infections of the body surface. This is the first part of topic number 14. We were going to talk about the skin. So just a reminder that the skin is the body's first line of defense. When we talked about the immune system, it contains a bunch of cells that are protecting you from invading organisms, and also there are a number of different secretions. The body surface also includes the conjunctiva, so you may have heard of conjunctivitis or pink eye. This is an infection of the eye. Itis, by the way, you may or may not know this, but itis means inflammation, so this is an inflammation of the surface of the eye. So what pathogens are we talking about? Many pathogens. I'm mostly just going to focus on these two, Staphylococcus and Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So we've already talked a lot about Staphylococcus, and we're going to talk a lot more about Staphylococcus today. We're also going to talk a little bit about Pseudomonas. So here are some bacteria that cause common skin infections. We have not talked about this one at all. I'm not going to want you to worry about this one for this semester, but you may get an idea from the name, acnes, that this is responsible for acne. Not usually causing serious infections other than messing up with your complexion. We've also talked about Staphylococcus epidermidis. We will not be talking about this today in any detail other than that we've talked about it already. Staphylococcus aureus, yes, we're going to talk about this one in a lot of detail right now. And we're also going to talk about Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So take a look at your notes and see what it says about these, and I'll have a few new things to say about them. Okay, so let's talk about Staphylococcus, our old friend Staphylococcus. So why is it so successful at giving us infections? It has many virulence factors. So if you remember what a virulence factor is, this means something that gives it the ability to cause disease. So what kind of things does staph have? It has salt tolerance, so it can survive on your skin. It can form slime layers and biofilms. Sometimes it carries a penicillinase, so that's an enzyme that makes it resistant to penicillin. And it has somewhere around 70 toxins and enzymes that help it to invade and destroy tissue. So things like collagenases that help it to invade connective tissues and so on. So where does it come from? It lives on us. Staphylococcus aureus, I'd mentioned before, is a transient microbe. That means it lives on us. You can see that number there, a third of the time. I've also read about 25% of the time. So it comes and goes. So since it's on our skin, it can be spread by direct contact, or probably the big spreading technique is by fomites. So think about all the possible things in a hospital otherwise. You could have doorknobs, you could have gowns, you could have counters, you could have cell phones, all sorts of various things could have Staphylococcus on it because our skin comes in contact with just about everything. So what kind of infections are we talking about in a hospital? Obviously skin infections, but Staphylococcus has the ability to get much deeper into tissues and infect almost any organ system you can imagine. You'll see it comes up again and again in the lists of various infections of the human body that we're going to talk about for the rest of this unit. Notice the three I have here: surgical wounds, so invasive procedures in hospitals, intravenous line incisions, and catheters. So all these invasive techniques are used constantly on a daily basis in a hospital. So a lot of people get infected, and often that infection is from staph. Who's most susceptible? Many people in hospitals, old, new, anybody who's immunocompromised. So here is a stat for you. It says here about 0.5% of nosocomial infections are caused by Staphylococcus aureus. That is a crazy number. And about half of those are drug resistant in some form or another. So it says about 50% are MRSA. This does vary from hospital to hospital, but those are staggering numbers. So if you take a look at the case where about 1 in 10 people who stay in a hospital overnight are likely to get a secondary infection, about half of those are going to get a staph infection, and about half of those will get MRSA. So that's very significant. If you think about 100 people in a hospital, that means about 3 of them will end with an MRSA infection each day. It's kind of scary. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the infections caused by staph. Mostly in this unit we'll be focusing on skin infections, but keep an eye open. You'll see that staph does pop up again in my list again and again and again. So first one here is folliculitis. So what does that mean? This is infection of a hair follicle. So really we're talking about pimples. Usually these are not serious other than, like I said, messing with your complexion. If you have it on the skin, it's called a pimple. And a pimple is really just an infection with a little bit of pus in there. The pus is of course full of white blood cells and lymph fluid and can cause redness, inflammation, sometimes pain, and those kind of things. If it's near the eye, in the eyelash, we often call it a stye, but really it's the same thing. It's just a pimple in a specific part of the body. A little bit more serious are infections of Staphylococcus that are going a little bit more greater in depth. So one infection that's pretty common, particularly amongst children, is impetigo. So you can see it says here it's a little bit deeper. Often you're looking at infections on the face or sometimes on the hands. And it's a little bit more painful. The skin is peeling off a little bit more. It's red. And like I said, very, very common amongst children, but adults can get it too. Highly infectious, but is treatable by antibiotics. We can get deeper into the tissue. We'd have things like boils. These tend to have a little bit more into the dermis and a lot more pus. A much more serious skin infection is SSSS, which is staphylococcal scalded skin syndrome. So what is this? This is a small percentage of strains have certain toxins that can actually destroy the skin in a certain way. Usually this is found only in immunocompromised patients, but you can imagine it can be very, very serious as a significant amount of skin can start falling off. So this is just a small list of many of the skin infections that are caused by Staphylococcus. Like I said, that can cause many, many body infections, but it does start usually at the skin. So one more infection that you may or may not be aware of, we had talked about it briefly when we were talking about the mechanisms of pathogenicity, is toxic shock syndrome. This is a warning label from a box of tampons. So what is toxic shock syndrome? This is a reaction of the immune system to a particular protein. So in this case here, we're talking about this protein here. It's called the TSS-1 toxin. This is something that can be produced by Staphylococcus, and anybody can be affected by this toxin, and the toxin can cause toxic shock syndrome. So just getting Staphylococcus in your blood can lead to toxic shock syndrome, which really is the immune system overreacting to this toxin. So we're looking at things like fever, alterations in blood pressure, and in some severe cases, people will actually, it can be fatal. So like I said, men and women are more susceptible to this. There were a number of cases back, I believe in the 1980s, with these superabsorptive tampons that women were having higher frequencies of toxic shock syndrome, and because people were leaving them in too long, which I think, as I talked about before in class, this really is an effective way to make a blood culture of Staphylococcus. And when you have an overproduction of the toxin, it gets in the bloodstream, it can lead to toxic shock syndrome. So how do we diagnose Staphylococcus? For the most part, it's pretty easy. We can do a gram stain, and you can see it says here grape-like bacteria. So you already know that Staphylococcus is, they're spherical cells and they're found in clusters. Very easy to see under a gram stain. The question is, of course, whether you have Staphylococcus epidermidis or Staphylococcus aureus. So usually this is followed by a whole bunch of biochemical tests after the initial diagnosis. And sometimes those biochemical tests will actually be looking at what kind of antibiotics it is susceptible to. Since there's a lot of resistance, clinicians need to know what drugs are going to work and what drugs are not going to work. So treatment traditionally was methicillin. So methicillin is a type of penicillin, and it used to be quite effective. This is why MRSA, which is methicillin resistant, was quite serious at the time. So now sometimes it's a matter of going through different types of antibiotics. Sometimes people will try non-penicillin drugs. Sometimes people will try, just trying to think, ciprofloxacin I think is another one. There's a whole bunch of different possible treatments, and there's no really one standard treatment because of all the resistance that exists in this particular organism. Prevention: clean, sterile hospital. Getting people to wash their hands, isolating people who are MRSA positive, getting people to change gowns, wear gowns when they're treating these patients. There's all sorts of procedures of which, when you do work in a hospital, I'm sure you'll become aware of. Okay, so let's talk about Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So I have a little bit of a soft spot in my heart for this organism because I did work on it for a number of years. And it kind of has a neat name, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, almost musical to it. So notice the comment I have here. It says it's another troublemaker. So this particular organism looks a lot like E. coli under a microscope. It's a rod-shaped gram-negative organism. It has a really amazing ability to grow in a variety of places. It does this often by forming biofilms. And I'll show you some other pictures of it on the next slide. So what else can we say about Pseudomonas is that it's naturally resistant to a lot of antibiotics. For some reason, it seems to have the ability to just be naturally resistant. It's got an extra tight membrane, it's got extra efflux pumps, things like that that help it to resist a lot of drugs. So here's the good news for us, since I think most of us are pretty healthy. It rarely causes disease in healthy individuals. That's great, that's good. Except for if you're in a hospital, you may not necessarily be healthy. So here's some numbers: 10 to 75% of nosocomial infections. Again, this depends on the hospital. Some places it's really high, some places it's really low. So here is Pseudomonas here, growing on a petri dish. Often it grows in a variety of colors. Usually green is one of the colors. You can see a greenish tinge to it. That's actually producing something called alginate when it produces a biofilm. That's kind of a sticky carbohydrate substance, and sometimes it comes out purple as well. I'll show you some pictures of some wounds. So here is somebody with a Pseudomonas infection in their fingernail, and you can see that greenish tinge to it. Here's somebody with some severe burning, and unfortunately it looks like their bandages have become infected by Pseudomonas aeruginosa. This is going to be very hard to treat for this individual. The burns are, of course, going to be very, very painful, and having an infection on the burns can often be life-threatening. So what kind of infections, you're wondering, can be caused by Pseudomonas aeruginosa? Pretty much any type of infection you could imagine. Here are some of the common ones. Cystic fibrosis pneumonia. So people with cystic fibrosis have an extra thick mucus in their lungs, and they can get pneumonia from Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which can in some cases be fatal. Urinary tract infections. Gastrointestinal infections, you can see in some cancer patients and premature infants. Again, people with immune systems that aren't fully functional. Like I said, this is a very good opportunistic infection. Skin infections, so I mentioned burn infections, also wound infections. And ear infections. So, like I said, if you're healthy, you're usually okay, but it is very good at being an opportunistic organism. So, remember this organism. I will have at least one or two probably short answer or multiple choice questions on the final exam about Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Okay, so I want to finish up this part just reminding you of some of the other skin infections that we talked about. So one of them, of course, we talked about a few times was anthrax. Anthrax is caused by Bacillus anthracis. So I had mentioned that this was a spore former, and it's found in the soil. You can see that in this particular infection, a person is getting cutaneous anthrax. So it's infecting the skin, and it's killing the tissue. So the tissue is necrotic, and it gets this black kind of blistery look to it. There's a picture here on the right. You can see what an anthrax wound looks like. We can also get inhalation anthrax, which is a lot more serious. Thankfully, most humans are not getting inhalation anthrax. That's more of an issue in animals who dig around in the dirt. We also have viruses that infect the skin. So we, of course, have herpes viruses. Remember, herpes viruses are envelope DNA viruses. Which herpes viruses are we talking about? Herpes simplex 1 and herpes simplex 2. So oral herpes and genital herpes. Here are some pictures for you. Oral herpes also is known as cold sores. Genital herpes is often known just as herpes. So it can be spread by human contact. In the case of genital herpes, often sexual contact. So the other herpes virus I have on this list is the varicella zoster virus. So this is the virus that is responsible for chickenpox and of course also shingles. So remember, you get chickenpox, or we used to get chickenpox. About 95% of the population used to get chickenpox by the time they were 15. And it usually was not too much of a serious infection. In some cases it would be. It does also infect the respiratory system. What can be more serious, or at least painful, is shingles. So people who get chickenpox, like any herpes virus, it is an infection for life, and it has a chance of re-emerging. So people often get shingles later on in life when their immune system is a little weaker, and maybe those memory cells are starting to get old, and they end up with a re-emergence of the virus from the person's nervous tissue. Shingles, you're often looking at a rash on the chest or back. In some cases, because it's in the nerves, it can be quite painful. You don't have to be old, though, to get shingles. I do know people who have had shingles in their 30s, and in one case it wasn't too serious. In another case, the person was not able to work for at least a few weeks because of the amount of pain. We have lots of viruses that infect the skin and cause all sorts of rashes. I want to take a little bit of time now to talk about measles. I never used to talk as much about measles because it was practically eradicated in Canada. But due to people not getting vaccinations, measles is making a pretty serious comeback, so it's worth it to talk about. Notice measles is also called rubeola. I don't like using that name because there's also rubella, and people get a little mixed up with other infections. So I'm just going to call it measles. It's an RNA virus. It's enveloped, and people get a rash, and typically it's a rash all over the body. Here's what it looks like. Here's a picture I found on the internet of a child with measles. It's not just a rash. Measles is a very serious disease. Some people do not take it seriously enough. Notice these other symptoms. They're talking about fevers and a cough and a runny nose and watery eyes and then the rash. But the other thing about measles is that it can actually seriously impair a person's immune system. Measles, the virus, actually kills memory cells. So what does that mean? It means if you get infected with measles, a big part of your immune system can be shut down, and you can get all sorts of secondary infections. I'm not sure what the death rate is. You can look that up, but children die from measles on a regular basis. If you take a look at what was going on in the Congo with all the Ebola deaths a couple of years ago, there were more deaths from measles than there were from Ebola, and that was because people were not getting the vaccines they needed due to the Ebola crisis. Here's some interesting charts I want to show you about measles and the power of vaccines. So these are American numbers, but the Canadian graphs look very similar. I just really like these graphs. You can see here 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, lots of cases of measles. The vaccine came out in the 1960s, and the number of cases just plummeted way, way down. Pretty much every child would get measles as a rite of passage up until the vaccine came out, and it's possibly the most highly infectious virus on the actual planet. So you can see the number of cases plummeted, and it was declared basically gone by the year 2000 and eradicated from North America. So take a look at this. Let's zoom in on the last few years in the United States, and you can see that we have this reemergence. 2010, 63 cases. 2014, 667 cases. I think that was the year that there was the outbreak that was linked to Disneyland. I'm not sure what happened here last year in 2019, but 940 cases. And this is all just from people not getting a vaccine. We need to have about 95% of the population vaccinated to get herd immunity from measles. It is so infectious. I'll show you some Canadian numbers. So again, if you take a look at this, 1950s, we got about 60,000 cases here in 1950. The rates are kind of going down. Vaccine comes out in 1963. The cases plummet, they go down, and the year 2000, we're looking at basically it being eradicated from Canada. Notice here, 2011, we had a big outbreak. I believe that was the year there was a big outbreak in Quebec in 2011, and since then the cases have gone down. Governments have been a little bit more serious about getting people vaccinated and allowing a lot less exemptions in Canada anyway. We will see where this goes. It's just a real shame that people are not getting the measles vaccine. It can prevent a lot of serious illness and a significant number of deaths. Okay, so a couple more things to say about measles before we move on. I think I mentioned before already, I mentioned about chickenpox, is that it does infect the respiratory system. This is the same with measles, which is why it is so infectious, in that the virus particles actually become airborne. And what I mean by that is that if somebody has measles and they're in a room, it gets into the air and floats around in the air. This is not like respiratory droplets that drop due to gravity. That can be in the air for hours, and somebody can walk in that room 3 hours later and still get infected by the measles virus. So here are some numbers. It says if you're unvaccinated and exposed, you get about a 90% chance of getting it. Very, very infectious. I mentioned it affects the immune system. Here are some numbers. It says it infects about 10 million children a year, and that's about 100,000 deaths. Complications, I'd mentioned pneumonia. I can't remember if I mentioned that or not, but also encephalitis, which means it's infecting the brain. We'll talk about encephalitis a little bit later on in this unit. So let's not get measles, which is rubeola, mixed up with rubella. So rubella is also sometimes affectionately called German measles. So notice the rashes are just a little bit different, and if you take a look at the viruses, this is a negative stranded RNA virus, and the rubella virus is a positive stranded RNA virus. So they are actually different viruses. What they do have in common is they cause rashes, there can be other complications, and both are hugely important for pregnant women, that they do not spread it to their fetus. Both of these diseases can get spread to the fetus and can cause complications to the unborn child, which has, of course, no immunity initially. The good news about both of them is that they are part of the MMRV vaccine and are totally preventable. So we have a few fungal skin infections we talked about. We talked about yeast infections. So yeast infections, mostly we were talking about Candida albicans, which the clinical term is candidiasis. So there's the word there. And mostly we're talking about thrush, which is an oral infection, or of course vaginitis, or sometimes just called a vaginal yeast infection. Other skin infections, there are many, many types of fungi that can cause these skin infections. They're usually just called tinea, which just means a skin mycosis. And like I said, many, many different organisms that can cause these skin infections. Often they are named after the location on the body. So the common names, things like athlete's foot or jock itch or other types of infections like that. Notice they all have tinea in front of them, and then usually a Latin kind of word after them referring to the body part. So tinea pedis for athlete's foot. So there's some athlete's foot, extreme itchiness, some scaling, of course around the foot, can be found in other parts of the body. Some of that scaling is from the scratching, some of it is from the immune system reacting to the inflammation and the itchiness. So some skin infections by fungi are also called ringworms. So notice these rashes on this woman look like little rings. This is not caused by a worm. This is a fungal skin infection. So if you see that term, ringworm, it does not mean a worm, it means a fungus. So how are these spread? Usually by direct contact or fomites. So you can imagine that sometimes people might get these infections from the gym if they're sitting on a bench, or people can share towels and things like that. Very, very easy to spread these things. These fungi are found all over the place in the environment, so easy to catch them. Prevention: keep your skin dry. Some people get reoccurring athlete's foot in the spring just due to all that moisture that comes out in the air. It's important for them to keep their skin dry. How can we treat this? There are many antifungals, particularly azoles, one of the drugs we talked about, imidazole, micronazole, those kind of things. Usually they can clear up quite readily with a little bit of skin treatment. So lastly, I want to finish off and mention that there are animals that can affect our skin. So insects and arthropods, there are all sorts of them. The ones that are specific to humans, of course, are lice. We talked about the three kinds of lice: head lice, body lice, and pubic lice. These are basically insects that are designed to feed on human blood, so they are human specific. We also talked about scabies. This is not an insect. It has 8 legs. It's a mite, and this will burrow under the skin, also found in the soil. I'm not 100% sure if scabies is specific to humans. I think actually pets can get it as well. We also talked about the schistosomes, and the one schistosome to remember is this one here that causes the swimmer itch. So remember that this particular organism is basically usually involved with ducks. So there's D-U-C-K, ducks. And like all schistosomes, the other organism is some sort of snail. So that was something that was on your second midterm. So this is the end of the first part of topic 14. I'm going to try to keep these short. There should be about 2 or 3 more segments, and then, like I said, I will finish up and try to do some review for next week. Hope everyone's having a great day and enjoying the wonderful snow.